The room pulsed with a quiet pressure that built with every second. Courtroom 4 wasn't just full, it was overfull. Every bench was crammed with legal aides, interns, analysts, and reporters, some sitting on the floor, others crowding the back wall. Even the overflow room next door buzzed with anticipation, a live feed projected onto the walls like some modern-day theater of justice. At the center of the storm stood Karoline Leavitt, poised, elegant, and dangerously calm. Her deep navy blazer hugged her frame in precise lines, and her blonde hair was swept back in a twist that betrayed no nonsense. Yet despite her exterior calm, her body was a battlefield of nerves. Every heartbeat echoed like a drumline beneath her ribs. She knew what this day meant, not just for her, but for the idea that truth could still stand against power. Across the courtroom, on the elevated bench that loomed like a throne of consequence, Judge Douglas Whitaker observed her with a gaze that could cut glass. His gray eyes, cool and clinical behind silver spectacles, held the weight of someone used to obedience. Authority wasn't something he wore, it was something he exhaled. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice as crisp as ice, "this is the second time you've interrupted the proceedings." The moment froze. A flicker of motion from Karoline's attorney, Daniel Reeves, mid-40s, composed but tightly coiled, signaled an imminent objection. But beside him, at the defense table, Pam Bondi simply reached out and rested a hand on his arm. Not yet. Pam's presence alone shifted the energy. Known nationally, respected, even feared, Pam wasn't just another lawyer. She was a tactician, a former prosecutor with an iron will and a near-psychic sense of when to strike. She leaned forward ever so slightly, eyes on the judge, pen hovering above a blank yellow legal pad. Karoline inhaled slowly. If they wanted her silent, they would have to break her voice first. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I'm not interrupting. I'm correcting a factual misstatement." The room rippled. Reporters leaned forward. Pens scratched faster. A few mouths hung open. Whitaker's face hardened. His robe shifted slightly as he leaned down. "Miss Leavitt, this is a court of law, not a campaign rally." "I'm responding under oath," she replied, steady as glass. "That's not grandstanding. That's my obligation." Her attorney whispered under his breath, "Textbook. Strong." Pam didn't even blink. She was watching Whitaker, watching the way his jaw tensed, the way his hand inched toward the bench. And then it came. Slam. The judge's palm struck wood like thunder. "Enough," he thundered. "You are in contempt of court. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody." Audible gasps. Chairs scraped. Reporters turned to one another in disbelief. Karoline's attorney stood up in protest. "Your Honor, this is excessive. We object." "Objection is overruled," Whitaker shot back. The bailiff, a man in his late 50s who clearly wasn't prepared for this turn of events, hesitated. He approached Karoline slowly. "Ma'am, please stand." She rose, her hands calmly at her sides. No flinch. No resistance. As though this were a photo op, not a public shaming. "Hands behind your back, please." She complied. The cold steel cuffs closed with a decisive click. The sound echoed like judgment. Reporters scribbled faster. A few had their phones low, discreetly recording, despite court rules. Even the prosecutor, seated across from the defense, looked uncertain. This wasn't standard procedure. This was theater, and everyone knew it. Pam Bondi finally moved. She didn't rise quickly or make a show of her objection. She stood like a queen in a chess game, just as dangerous, just as patient. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but carrying like a gavel strike, "the defense formally objects to this ruling." Judge Whitaker didn't even turn his head. "Your objection is noted. It does not alter the finding." Pam raised an eyebrow, then held up a document stamped and sealed. "It does now." The courtroom turned. "This morning, we filed for an emergency stay with the United States District Court. Signed by Judge Matthew Harlan at 9:45 a.m. It halts any enforcement actions, including contempt custody." Judge Whitaker's eyes narrowed. He didn't reach for the document. He gestured for the court clerk, who stepped forward and accepted it. She read. Out loud. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Some stood. Phones lit up. Filed. Under the jurisdiction of Judge Harlan. Emergency stay. Prohibits any custodial action tied to contempt findings until federal review is complete. Whitaker looked up at the clock on the wall. 10:02 a.m. Correct, Pam said evenly. 7 minutes before your ruling. The tension was no longer Karoline's to carry. It now belonged to the bench. Judge Whitaker, visibly shaken for the first time that morning, adjusted his glasses and leaned back. We will recess for 10 minutes to review this filing. The gavel struck again, but this time it sounded defensive, less like a command and more like an escape. The bailiff turned to Karoline. Until instructed otherwise, the restraints remain, he said, his voice low. She nodded. There was no fear in her. No weakness. Just resolve. Pam leaned in. You're not going anywhere. Karoline closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight roll off her shoulders. Her attorney whispered to Pam. Stay's language is airtight. They can't move on her now. Pam nodded. Her eyes never left the judge's bench. He moved too fast. Now he's vulnerable. And everyone in the courtroom knew. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a war of strategy. And Judge Whitaker had just lost the first battle. The 10-minute recess stretched to nearly an hour. Judge Whitaker hadn't returned to the bench. And while the court staff paced nervously and whispers filled the gallery like a low tide, Pam Bondi remained still. Studying every exit, every angle, and most of all, every silence. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt sat cuffed but uncowed, her eyes sharp and unblinking. The heavy courtroom air felt like it was suffocating most, but not her. If Whitaker thought he could silence her with restraints, he hadn't learned a thing about who she was. She wasn't here as a witness. She was here as a storm. The double doors creaked open. Judge Whitaker returned, robe flowing behind him like smoke. His face was unreadable, but something had changed. The arrogance was still there, but it was tighter now. Calculated. And cold. The emergency stay has been reviewed, he announced, his voice now cool rather than thunderous. In light of federal jurisdiction, the contempt order is suspended. A visible wave of relief washed over the defense table. The bailiff moved quickly, uncuffing Karoline with the delicacy of someone who knew they'd just played a losing hand. She rubbed her wrists briefly but didn't break eye contact with the judge. But, Whitaker continued, this court still has a duty to assess the credibility of its witnesses. Miss Leavitt's conduct this morning, while protected from contempt, raises questions about motive and possible political coordination. The gallery reacted instantly. Not with gasps, this wasn't TV drama, but with something worse. Muttering, judgment, assumption. A courtroom full of people suddenly wondering, is she playing a game? And Whitaker knew it. Pam Bondi's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward, lips barely moving as she whispered to Karoline. He's shifting tactics. From punishment to smear. Karoline whispered back, let him. He's walking into the trap. The judge continued. Given Miss Leavitt's political affiliations and current role as a senior campaign advisor, the court questions whether her testimony is being shaped by partisan interests. Objection, Pam stood. Unless Your Honor intends to depose every witness with a political affiliation, this is a targeted attack, not a legal standard. This witness is not just any political figure, the judge countered, now showing a hint of fire again. She's a national spokesperson with direct ties to the former president. Her words influence millions. The court cannot ignore that reality. And just like that, Whitaker did what he hadn't dared before. He made Karoline's political identity the trial's battlefield. The gallery was now fully engaged. Reporters typed furiously. Cameras outside the courtroom were surely catching real-time reactions as leaks made their way to cable news. Pam raised her voice. Are you suggesting that her First Amendment rights are grounds for impeachment of testimony? I'm suggesting, Whitaker said slowly, that if this court is to accept Miss Leavitt's narrative, it must do so in the full context of her public role, her coordination with defense counsel, and her financial ties to political PACs. Pam froze for half a beat. That wasn't just political posturing. That was a direct allegation. An attempt to claim that Karoline's defense was being funded for strategic messaging, not truth. It was poison, wrapped in legal language. Pam turned to her assistant and whispered, "Get me the FEC filings. Now." Then she looked back at Whitaker. "Your Honor, we will provide documentation demonstrating that Miss Leavitt is not receiving funding from any PACs or legal action committees for this testimony. And furthermore, we will subpoena any communications between this court and third-party reporters regarding pretrial leaks, if this line of questioning continues." The room snapped to attention. Pam Bondi had just threatened the bench. And she did it with velvet in her voice and a dagger in her eyes. Judge Whitaker didn't respond immediately. He knew the cameras, though not aloud, were listening through every written word, every paraphrased headline already firing across the internet. He couldn't afford to look weak. But he also couldn't afford to be investigated. "Motion taken under advisement," he finally said, before tapping his pen sharply on the desk. "We'll proceed." But everyone in the room knew the war had changed. This wasn't about facts anymore. It was about credibility and perception and the shadows where real power lives. Later that afternoon, as the day's session wrapped, Karoline and Pam stood outside the courthouse in front of a thick wall of reporters. The media had grown to twice its size since morning. Camera lights flickered like paparazzi. A reporter shouted, "Karoline, are you being paid to defend the former president?" She stepped forward, her voice clear and unapologetic. "I'm not here to defend a man. I'm here to defend truth. And if you're afraid of it, maybe you should ask why." Pam didn't smile. But she didn't need to. The trap was working. And back inside, alone in his chambers, Judge Whitaker stared at his reflection in the glass wall. His face was still. But behind his eyes, the fury was building. He'd been publicly challenged, cornered, and tomorrow, he'd strike back. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, as if the very air were waiting to exhale. A storm of political controversy and legal uncertainty had brought them here, to this single room, this final moment, with eyes from across the nation watching every breath, every pause, every misstep. Judge Whitaker sat like a marble statue atop his elevated bench. But behind his composed exterior was a man unraveling. His pride, his authority, and perhaps even his career now rested on how he handled the next few hours. He had fought battles in silence, off-camera phone calls, pressure from donors, party operatives whispering about future nominations. But none of them were here now. Here he was alone. Across the aisle, Pam Bondi reviewed her notes one last time. She was no stranger to high-pressure trials, but this was different. This wasn't just about her client. It wasn't even about Trump. It was about the integrity of a system teetering on the edge of collapse. And next to her sat Karoline Leavitt, visibly changed. Gone was the overly scripted media darling. Her hair was pulled back, her blazer slightly wrinkled, her voice now carrying a quiet steeliness that comes only from walking through fire and coming out scarred, but unbroken. The final day of trial began. "Judge Whitaker, we proceed now with closing statements. Defense may begin." Pam stepped forward, voice calm but precise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, if this still is a court, I ask you not just to look at the evidence, but to look at the machinery behind this prosecution. You have witnessed, in real time, a weaponization of legal process to silence political dissent." She paused, letting the words settle like dust after a detonation. When Ms. Leavitt was asked to testify, she complied. When she was accused, she stood firm. But when she asked the court to respect the constitutional rights she still has as an American citizen, she was threatened with imprisonment. Her eyes flicked briefly to Whitaker. He did not flinch, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed the blow. Ask yourselves, who benefits from her silence? Who fears her words? The answer lies not in this courtroom, but far beyond it. She returned to her seat. Then Karoline stood, not because she had to, but because this was the moment she had earned. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she began. "I was supposed to be a warning. A cautionary tale. Don't defend the wrong people. Don't question the narrative. Don't speak unless you're told what to say." But I refused. Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but force. They told me if I testified honestly, I'd be protected. Instead, I was mocked on every news channel. They told me this court would be impartial. Instead, it became a tool. They told me the law would shield me. But it was used as a sword. Cameras clicked. Reporters frantically typed. But what they didn't count on was that I wouldn't break. That even when the judge threatened to jail me, I would not lie. That when they dragged my name through the dirt, I would still show up. Every single day. She turned to Whitaker. And now the world sees you, not as a judge, but as an enforcer. And I ask not for your favor or your mercy. I ask only that you remember, history is watching. The room was stunned. Judge Whitaker was about to speak when a court officer walked briskly in, handing him a sealed envelope. He read it in silence. As his eyes moved across the page, something inside him deflated. His posture loosened. His mask cracked. This court has received a directive from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, he said at last, voice suddenly hollow. Effective immediately, proceedings in this matter are suspended and jurisdiction is transferred to the federal judiciary pending review of judicial conduct. Guess. Reporters jumping from their seats. Phones flashing. What does that mean? Someone called from the gallery. Pam Bondi didn't turn around. She already knew. It meant they won. Not just the case, but the war of legitimacy. The judge stood. He looked down at Karoline one final time, not with anger nor triumph, but something closer to dread. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated all of them. This court is adjourned, he said without the gavel. And then he walked away, his footsteps echoing off marble as the once mighty man disappeared into the wings of a broken institution. 3 weeks later, Karoline Leavitt walked into a CNN studio for her first live interview post-trial. She wore no makeup beyond the minimum, no prepared talking points. She didn't need them. The anchor leaned forward. "Do you feel vindicated?" She smiled, but it was not a smile of victory. "I feel seen," she said. "And I feel ready." Ready for what? The next battle. Because this wasn't the last. Across the country, Pam Bondi declined dozens of offers for book deals. She returned quietly to Tampa, where she opened a legal foundation aimed at defending whistleblowers and political dissidents. The office didn't have a name on the door, but it had a line out the block. As for Judge Whitaker, he resigned under pressure. A federal ethics inquiry loomed. He disappeared from public life, but the court he left behind would never be the same. His name would appear in law textbooks, but not as a scholar, as a warning. And somewhere deep in the heart of Washington, a new kind of resistance was forming, not of protests or punditry, but of people who had seen firsthand what happened when justice became a tool instead of a shield. And at the center of it stood a young woman once ridiculed, once threatened, once nearly erased. Karoline Leavitt. No longer a defendant. Now a symbol.